members of the subcommittee. HB 402 establishes that law enforcement using body-worn camera systems shall follow the guidelines of the model policy established by the Department of Criminal Justice Services. I'd like to begin with 2 line amendments, if I could, please. Mr. Chairman, I can explain the line amendments?
Yes.
Okay, so the first line amendment makes clear that the original bill said that the police shall identify best practices, be consistent with Virginia law and regulation, using its guidance, the model policy established by DCJS. There was a concern that identified best practices may be different from the model policy established by DCJS. This just takes out the identified best practices and makes clear that it's the DCJS guidelines that control. That's the first line amendment. The second line amendment deals with the fact that some police, law enforcement in Virginia have already established policies on body-worn camera systems. So this makes it clear that it's only for the new ones established after this law goes into effect July 1st, 2018. So it kind of grandfathers in the old policies. That's what the line amendments do. And I would ask that those line amendments be added to the bill, but I'm happy to continue to explain that.
Sure. Is there a motion on the amendments? I'll second. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is a policy, it sets up a statewide policy on body-worn camera systems. Currently, there's nothing in the code on body-worn camera systems, and this is an idea whose time has come. It's growing all across the nation. It's growing all across Virginia. Several jurisdictions in Virginia have already, as I noted, established body-worn camera systems, including Chesterfield, Fredericksburg, and in fact, Fairfax County is just starting one. And the policies are different. They disagree on certain things. They disagree on retention. They disagree on when you turn them on, when you turn them off. They're kind of all over the map, and that's understandable for a new system that's coming into place. There's going to be disagreements on things like this. The DCJS a couple of years ago set up a group of stakeholders that developed a model policy. And they worked together for about a year on this. A number of people in the room, I know the ACLU is unhappy that they were not in the room, but the policy did establish a number of things. It established, for example, that officers are to turn on their cameras during any interaction with the public and during tactical activities. That for privacy purposes, officers are to inform subjects that are being recorded whenever it is practical to do so. That they may decline the recording if it's in a place where you'd expect privacy, not to be used in strip searches, bathrooms, locker rooms. It allows for FOIA requests, blurring of images, and it specifically says that if it's in the middle of an investigation, any video that would jeopardize an investigation, prosecution, or safety would be excluded from the FOIA request. So it is a detailed model policy. Again, I know the ACLU does not feel this policy goes far enough. They don't think it's perfect, and they're going to testify against this bill in a minute. But this bill is supported by the police, supported by the sheriffs, and it's supported by the NAACP, all of which came into a room last year with Glenn Davis and me, and we got about 12 stakeholders agreeing to this bill. What this bill does is establishes those guidelines, puts them in the code, and also makes clear that you need to have a written policy. And I think a written policy is important. We don't want people coming in there and having a system where the videos are shown sometimes and not shown other times inconsistently. The reason for these policies is we're trying to engender respect for law enforcement, respect within communities that doubt law enforcement when there are shootings without police cameras. And sometimes we don't know who was right. The best thing about body cameras is they protect the truth. If the citizen was wrong and the police officer was right, the body camera shows that the police officer was right. If conversely the police officer was wrong and the citizen was right, the camera shows. This does not require any locality to install a body-worn camera system. All it says is if they install one, they have to follow the guidelines of DCJS. They have to have a written system. It has to be available for public comment and review, because we want the public to have a role in this. We don't want Virginia to have a lot of protests in the streets, some of the things we've seen in other areas of the country where the community is at odds with law enforcement over these things. So this is something, again, when the NAACP, the police, and the sheriffs are all on board, I think this is something that should be enacted. As I said, the ACLU opposes this. They don't think it goes far enough. My response to them, and I'm sure they're going to testify in a minute, is that DCJS can improve its model policies over time. As we see which systems work and how they don't work, as we see Fredericksburg doing it one way and Fairfax doing it another way, and maybe 60 days is right, maybe 90 days is right. It doesn't specify how many days you save it. There are holes right now because not everybody agrees. But as this policy goes into place, as long as this law is in place, as they adopt their guidelines and modify their guidelines over time, then this law says that Virginia jurisdictions will have to follow those. And so I think the model policies will get better, and in 4 or 5 years we'll have a much clearer indication, and then DCJS can develop these policies and help make for a really good system in Virginia.
Okay. Any questions of the patron from the committee? Go to the wing.
Did I understand correctly, the DCGS already has this model policy? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, further question.
Go to the wing.
Why would we need your bill?
Because the bill, right now, they are not required to follow. No jurisdiction has to follow that model policy.
Okay.
This bill requires them to use that policy as guidelines.
Okay, hearing no further questions. Is anyone in the audience wishing to speak in favor of the measure?
Mr. Chairman, I'm John Jones, representing the Sheriff's Association. We strongly support the bill because it only requires that if the agency is going to use a body camera system, that they have a written policy for the public to know what's going on, and that the policy is published, and everyone in the community can know that, well, the local police and the sheriff, they're getting ready to do those policies, and everyone can look at it and determine what the impact is. For example, the Commonwealth Attorney, that's who it puts the work on. And I'll just tell you one story. The sheriff told me when he was considering a body camera, he wanted to look at storage, he wanted to look at FOIA and how it's going to be made available to the public. He wanted to establish his policy on when the officer turns it on and turns it off. And the public was coming to him and saying, Sheriff, when are you going to do your body camera? And he said, well, we have to take a look at everything. And then there was a town within the sheriff's county, within the county. They just went and hung a body camera on every officer with no policy and no guideline. And that's not what we want. You want the public to understand what's going on with the body camera, why it's there, and have access to it. And it's about transparency. So we do support this proposal passage.
Go to the Queen.
But if I'm understanding correctly, Elliott Levine, the policy's already there from DCJS, and any department that wants it, it's there. You can adopt it and make it your own. Is that right?
That's right. And what this bill addresses is the one that they hang a body camera on the officers without adopting anything. And it's just the model policy there to use. We encourage everyone to use it. We hope they would, but I know in one case where they had no policy, just hung it on the officers, and then the public was confused about, well, Sheriff, why aren't you doing it? There's a police officer doing it in your county. And the purpose of the bill is to say, you have all these resources, use them. Use the model policy by DCJS. Look at what the trend is on body cameras and make it available to the public. But the problem with the bill addresses is that there's a void where an agency can implement the body camera without doing anything on policy. And that's what this bill addresses.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman. In courts, we say when you try to fix something, you got a judge problem instead of a law problem. Sounds like you got a sheriff problem.
Well,
Because you got policies already in place.
I'm not sure it's a sheriff issue, but we support the bill. And let me say that, we set it out, we've got a big committee of sheriffs who review these bills, and this was overwhelming support.
You're asking us to tie your hands for you? Is that what you're asking?
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm David Ledbetter. I'm the Commonwealth's Attorney in the City of Waynesboro. I'm here on behalf of the Virginia Association of Commonwealth's Attorneys, and we do support this bill as it's been amended. We feel it's important if you're going to deploy a body camera system that you have a written policy. This bill also is prospective. It doesn't affect the departments that have already adopted the camera system. We feel it's important that they have a written policy. What this bill does is provides guidance by looking at the DCJS model, but it doesn't mandate that model. An individual department can still deviate that by looking at the policy and deciding that it doesn't fit them exactly. They can deviate from it and have public comment. And we do feel it's important right now, where there's not a requirement they have a written policy. We certainly fix that issue.
Mr. Chairman, doesn't give them the ability to deviate prospectively, does it?
What it does is it gives them, they do have to have the written policy, but in adopting their policy, they're simply to look at the DCJS model. They can deviate from that after public comment.
Further question, Mr. Chairman. Aren't you still going to have the same problem with a number of different disparate systems that you're speaking to? I mean, you're giving sheriffs the ability to implement the policy as it best suits them, but by having a bright line between old systems and new systems, the problem that you all are citing with a bunch of different systems that don't comply with the model policy, they're still going to be out there.
Essentially, the biggest problem is not having a written policy, having the ability to have a department to deploy without a written policy at all is the biggest issue. The status quo of disparate policy is still going to exist, and that exists now, that exists in the future, because they can deviate from that policy. They're not, their hands aren't tied.
Doesn't this bill go far beyond that, in that couldn't you just have something that says have a policy period? This one pretty much takes it in that whole nother direction.
It does tell them to look at the DCJS model as that, and that's a model that not an individual is adopted, it's just a group of stakeholders come together to bring that policy together. I'm not sure that there may be a few that will criticize that policy, but certainly that's a policy that has many stakeholders to come in, so it's a good idea to at least look at that policy.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Jesse Frierson, and I represent the Virginia State Conference and ACP, 15,000 members across the state, 80 branches. We support this bill. We support it for all of the reasons stated thus far, number one, as well as we support this bill from the perspective of increasing transparency between law enforcement and as well as the public. We came to this table about this particular bill several years ago and having a conversation with the Commonwealth Attorney. And he stated that he was caught in a situation of having to police the police about body cams because there were no standards. Not to use the term Wild Wild West, but there were a lot of things going on that in this particular case, Commonwealth Attorney indicated that this had become an additional part of his job, taking him away from other items. The goal and objective, from our perspective, is to have increased transparency between law enforcement and the public, as well as to increase the faith and confidence that the public has in law enforcement because of this new technology. It would be great to have new technology with the right policies and procedures to support it so that the public can have confidence in how this technology is being used without having to ask themselves among their communities, what's going on, would this happen with your family, that happen with your family? Well, wait a minute, these are different things that are going on in terms of how the technology is being used. So again, we support this particular bill, and we would ask you all to support it.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, my name is James St. John. I'm the Director of Special Projects with a private security company called Golden Seal Enterprises. We involve ourselves with issues of private policing, and we applaud DCGS for bringing this forward. As you may or may not know, we have private police departments here in the Commonwealth, and they basically fall under the things that other law enforcement entities fall under, and several of them do use body cameras. We encourage some sort of uniformity, primarily for the rights of the citizenry, because if police officers are wearing body cameras and there are no guidelines for them, and there are no guidelines for the use of the things captured by those cameras, it really does create a sense of uncertainty for the public. And so as public safety professionals, again, who involve ourselves with private policing in particular, we would support this bill. And again, we applaud DCGS for addressing the issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I have a question for you.
Delegate Brewer.
In line 244 of the bill, it says you address the storage and maintenance of body worn cameras and records. My concern here is that all localities in Virginia are not created equal. I represent very, very rural areas that are already constrained in their budgets. I see there's obviously not a fiscal impact, but there is one to localities. Has that been taken into consideration?
Well, the reason there's no fiscal impact is because the entire decision as to whether or not to employ body-worn cameras is optional. No locality is required by law or by this bill to employ a body-worn camera. This bill, if a locality can't afford it, they don't do it. All this bill says is if you are to decide to employ one, then you should adopt written policy with public comment and use the DCJS model as guidelines. But it does not require any fiscal impact because no locality is required to deploy the cameras.
But for those that already have it, they have to worry
Delegate Brewer.
about, they have to worry about cloud computing costs, storage, and management of such, correct?
That's correct. I would say, though, that, again, this policy doesn't apply to those that already have it. The line amendment makes clear that it's prospective. And again, it doesn't specify 30 days, 60 days, who has how much time to review it. Localities can change that, can adopt that within the DCJS guidelines. So if one locality finds it's too expensive to do it a certain way, they can do it another way. Again, this is one of the reasons why the ACLU doesn't like the bills, because it would allow for different policies among localities.
Mr. Chairman, following on that line of questioning, so if you have a locality that doesn't feel that they can meet the financial burdens of these model policies, they're not going to even try and implement something that works for them because there's that jump up to the model policy that they're going to feel like they can't afford. So isn't that correct?
Well, I don't know that is correct, because as the person for the Commonwealth Attorneys pointed out, what it says is that it should use DCJS policy as guidelines. The main thing that it requires a written policy. You can't put these in without a written policy. And I think if a locality had a written policy with public comment review and said we can't afford these DCJS guidelines, that I don't think require a certain amount of time of storage, at least right now. But if they can't, they could do that, and they could say, we're deviating from the guidelines because we can't afford this, and therefore we're doing this. At least they have spelled out transparently what they're doing, why they're doing it, and their public can judge them accordingly.
Okay, is there anyone in the audience wishing to speak in opposition to the matter?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Claire Guthrie Gastignagga, on behalf of the 42,000 members of the ACLU of Virginia. We agree with our colleagues from the NAACP and a lot of what's been said here about the importance of transparency and accountability for our police. And you know, the reality is that a body cam is only a tool of that transparency and accountability with the right policy in place. And unfortunately, we can't agree that the DCJS policy is the model that everybody should follow. You know, when we talk about stakeholders who were present when the policy was developed, they were all members of law enforcement and Commonwealth attorneys' offices. There weren't any citizen members on that group that developed the model policy. They were presented to the Governor's Task Force on Technology and Policing, and they said they weren't willing to adopt them yet. They had some additional questions, but they've gone forward anyway. We were allowed to provide comments after the fact, but not a word of the policies was changed from the original ones. So to say that, you know, stakeholders had a full role in developing the DCJS guidelines is a bit of a mischaracterization of what actually happened. We did a report almost 3 years ago now where we looked at 75 policies across the Commonwealth. And obviously we agree that if body cams are deployed without a written policy, that's not a good thing. I mean, and departments should have a good thing. We've worked very closely, for example, with the sheriff in Westmoreland, which is a small county with 15 active officers and 250 square miles of coverage. They have body cams, and they've developed and implemented a policy consistent with the model that we've developed that includes addressing some things like how long should you be keeping this information? The reality is the policy is cheaper to implement the shorter the period of time that you keep data and the less data you keep. And you know, the extraordinary difficulty of balancing between the public interest and accountability and the personal interest or privacy is exactly the policy debate that you all should be having and shouldn't be being resolved by 130 some odd different localities differently. If I experience a body cam in Henrico and in the city of Richmond, I should experience it the same way with respect to, can I see the video of me? We think under the Government Data Collection and Dissemination Practices Act, I have an absolute right to see the video of me. But that's not clear, and we may have to litigate that issue because it's not addressed in the model policy. How long are they gonna keep it? Are they gonna keep the video if I make a complaint for 2 years, which is the statute of limitations on my ability to bring a lawsuit against the department? Or are they gonna get rid of it in 7 days? If I don't file a complaint or ask for access to the video, they should, in fact, be encouraged to get rid of the video early and not keep it for 2 years like Chesapeake was. Essentially, all the film they had, they were keeping it for 2 years, regardless of whether it was needed in a particular situation. So there's some serious issues about transparency, where the model policy does not require transparency, accountability. The model policy does not say anything about what should happen to officers who violate the policy on a routine basis by not turning their cameras on when they're supposed to and that sort of thing. And there's some real problems with coming to some consensus about privacy. I mean, how long should this material be stored in the cloud? Who should be able to make use of it? And we are very concerned about all of those issues, and we would like to resolve them. And we'll be updating our report to see. I think the number of departments that have deployed without policies is much smaller than it was when we looked at this issue initially a couple of years ago. But because this bill doesn't do the most important thing that I think the legislature needs to do, which is set some uniform minimum standards that guarantee public access, balance the privacy against the accountability part, and really turn the body cams into a tool that will indeed accomplish the objectives that every one of us seeks, which is the transparency and accountability of departments. We would encourage you not to set the DCGS guidelines as the gold standard today, because we don't think they are. And thank you very much for letting me speak.
Anyone else in the audience wishing to speak in opposition?
Mr. Chairman, I believe Kevin Carroll walked in. I don't mean to put him on the spot, but he came in after the time to support the bill, and I believe he may support the bill and wanted to speak briefly.
I spoke with the delegate last night, who heavily supports the legislation.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Delegate Russell.
I just don't know how law enforcement or the judiciary held either themselves or judiciary holding them accountable without a written policy. So I hope if this turns into a letter that we encourage all localities have some kind of written policy to have that accountability mechanism. With that said, I hope in that letter, Mr. Chairman, that being the one who made the motion for the amendment, I'm actually not a big fan of the Second Amendment now, because while we can have a delayed enactment, this would further, I think, Swiss cheese some things. So I think making sure that we make it clear, hopefully, that we expect, for accountability purposes, everyone to have a written policy is absolutely critical in moving forward. They can maybe have latitude and flexibility in what that policy looks like, but I hope we can set that standard as we move forward, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just briefly, I think some of the concerns that Claire raised of the ACLU are appropriate. The DCGS policy is not perfect, but it can change over time. They can make it better. And as we learn more about experiences, it can be made better, and therefore the code would require them to use that guideline as it be made better. And as to Delegate Russell's comment, I mean, this was requested, obviously, of me by some of the proponents to get this passed, that they didn't want to rework the ones that were already done, but I certainly believe that whether or not this bill becomes law, that all police and law enforcement should have a written policy. But this is, as much as it does, It doesn't go far enough for many people, but I think it does go far. It does put us all on the right path.
Thank you. Okay, there a motion?
Mr. Chair.
Delegate Brewer.
I want to thank the patron for bringing the bill forward. You know, transparency obviously I think is very important, and I don't think anyone should disagree with that. Having said that, I think there's a lot of different aspects we have to take into account, including various departments and things of that nature. Having said that, I'd like to make a motion to leave on the table, allow DCGS the latitude while the reevaluating their training standards to look at this.
Would that include a letter from the chairman requesting that they include that?
Sure, I can, probably see CJS here, or have they gone?
Mr. Fitzpatrick?
This is out of order because there's a motion pending that has been
Well,
second.
Yeah. You want me to go ahead and give a second?
Well, before there's a second on it, because there's no debate on a motion to table, it's been seconded. Currently, there's not a review underway on cameras, is there?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Klein, there is not a review of the cameras, and the review that we're doing is about the job task analysis of officers, not on model policies.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to ask you to kind of weigh in on where things stand with the model policy that you currently have and the effectiveness of that.
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Klein, maybe we can talk at some point during session before that letter is drafted, so we can understand what the intention is of the model policy.
Well, it's not our model.
Well, what you're asking us to do.
Right. Yep. Okay.
All right, so there's a motion to table, requesting the chairman
With the letter.
send a letter.
Second.
And it's been properly second. All those in favor, please indicate so. Okay, please close the rolls. The motion to table with a letter to the chairman passes 4-1. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.